on Finance.
Thank you, Chair Campbell. Will the meeting of the Committee on Finance please come to order? It is now time for the committee to consider today's consent agenda. Does any committee member wish to remove any item from the consent agenda?
Sorry, but I have a question again.
Of course you do, Trustee Sebelius.
Well, item 5. It is an annual system-wide report on hate incidents on campus. Why is that in the Committee on Finance? Maybe there is no obviously committee that would be a natural fit, but since it's a student affairs matter mostly, and also a question maybe of student orientation, student life and counseling, should it not be better placed in the Committee of Educational Policy? Or since it's a reporting requirement, maybe in the Committee of Audit, but it seems to be so misplaced in the Committee of Finance.
I think it was just by default, as I understand it from Chancellor Relier, that would just happen to be in this committee. If there's a desire on the part of the board to move it to another committee, I wouldn't have any problem with that as Chair of Finance.
Trustee Sebelius, it's exactly as Trustee McGrory was saying. It's over the years, it's always been reported out of Finance. I think because of the reporting requirements under the CLARI, the Federal CLARI Act, that where we do this on an annual basis. It's always been under Finance because that's where the CLARI reporting sits in my area. But it's really something that we could really move to any other committee if we wanted to.
Maybe we should refer this item then, Romy, over to the Committee on Committees and they can discuss it.
And part of the recommendation could be to offer it jointly.
Yeah, that's true.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other items for discussion on the consent agenda? It's items 1 through 5.
I move the consent agenda.
I second it.
Any objection to the approval of the consent agenda? Hearing none, we'll move on to the discussion items. The first one is item 6. It's an action item. It's one of the most important items of the year, requesting approval of the 2021-2022 operating budget request. The item will be presented by Steve Relier and Ryan Storm. Steve?
Thank you, Chair McGrory. Back at our September board meeting, we discussed the need for additional resources from the state for the 2021-22 fiscal year to advance the CSU mission. Those discussions were key in preparing the proposed 2021-22 operating budget request, which we present today for the board's approval. You just heard from Executive Vice Chancellor Blanchard about the Graduation Initiative 2025, and that is clearly a critical driver of this operating budget request. If the state provides the requested resources, we'll build into our progress and build upon the framework that Vice Chancellor Blanchard described. Our additional progress for degree completion will add more high-demand course sections that are required for graduation, and will continue to implement other high-impact practices. Now, as we shared in our last meeting, the state's economy and its budget are expected to be down for some time. This points to a budget request that is tempered to the context of this moment in California, but still with an eye toward the long-term future of the California State University. Now, as we've seen, particularly this year, state tax revenues can significantly fluctuate. And in fact, state tax receipts are better than anticipated in the current fiscal year by $11.3 billion, or 1/3 of the estimated budget deficit for this year. So it's good news. Therefore, if the state budget were to continue to improve, we should have the university at least positioned for a potential additional investment by the state. And so we believe that this budget request that's before the board does just that. So now, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Budget, Ryan Storm, will walk you through the operating budget request. Ryan?
Thank you, Steve. Now, this slide includes the components of the proposed 2021-22 operating budget request. This is the Board of Trustees' request to the state of California to incrementally augment our operating budget for the upcoming fiscal year. detailed information on the proposed request is included in your materials as attachment A, and this includes a section on designated balances and reserves. This budget proposal is responsive to the trustees' feedback from the September board meeting, with the addition of one component and revised recurring dollar figures. So let's walk through each component of the operating budget request. First up is a grand total of $150 million for Graduation Initiative 2025. Of this amount, $120 million would be geared to the highest priorities of each campus's Graduation Initiative plan. Now, the consistent approach has been to provide campus leaders the flexibility and freedom to invest new grad initiative funding according to local needs. This approach has been a success, and the evidence is clear by the prior presentation. As just discussed in the Committee on Education Policy, we're once again making very good progress with this initiative. But as we have emphasized since the beginning, the Graduation Initiative requires a multi-year investment, and each year builds on the success of the prior year. We have proven that this initiative works when it is properly funded, and the product, which is more Californians with CSU degrees, that significantly benefits the state's economy, its society, and we will do so for decades, and it will do so for decades to come. Also, in response to the board's interest at the last board meeting, we proposed dedicating $30 million to the Basic Needs Initiative, which supports students experiencing food and housing insecurity, unanticipated financial distress, mental health concerns, and overall health and safety challenges. Now, a funding restoration is our next topic. The state reduced the CSU's base funding by $299 million, which is a 7.4% reduction in state funding. If a funding restoration does not occur, it will jeopardize future Grad Initiative 2025 success. It will also prevent the funding of mandatory costs, both in the current year as well as next year. And it will also challenge our ability to support current enrollment levels. As a result, the state should look to restore funding to the university in 21-22. The budget plan includes a $299 million recurring general fund restoration, which represents a 100% restoration of the budget cut the university is experiencing right now. Now next are, excuse me just a second. Next are academic facilities and infrastructure needs. Simply put, we have billions of dollars of necessary facility and infrastructure improvements. $50 million in new recurring funding is included in this request. Now, under current bond market conditions, dedicating $50 million of recurring funding would finance approximately $900 million of necessary facility and infrastructure projects. This funding would help support the 2021-22 five-year capital plan, which is an action item a little later today in the Committee on Campus Planning, Buildings, and Grounds. Now, our mandatory costs will total $57 million. This includes the cost to implement Assembly Bill 1460, which requires every CSU student to take an ethnic studies course. We would expect the governor and the legislature to fund this new mandate now that it is law. Other mandatory cost increases for existing university commitments include healthcare premium increases for CSU employees, increases to operations and maintenance of newly constructed facilities, and the next phase of the state minimum wage increase. Altogether, these investments total $556 million, and this plan assumes that 100% of the revenue to support this request would be supplied by the state. Our recurring operating budget would be $7.5 billion if this request is funded. Now, I'd like to turn it back over to Executive Vice Chancellor Rellier to describe our next steps.
Thank you, Ryan. So as for next steps, we'll deliver this budget request to the governor and the Department of Finance shortly after this meeting so that it can be considered for the governor's January budget proposal to the state. In the near future, we'll advocate in Sacramento for the budget request, a request that will promote the achievement of our students while recognizing the state's diminished capacity to invest significant additional funding. And you can also expect that we'll continue our collaboration with our campuses, our alumni, our students, and the CSU champions in the Capitol and in our communities. You can expect to hear more details about our advocacy strategy and related activities at future board meetings. At this stage, the length and the severity of the economic downturn is really not known. It is very possible that the state may reduce our recurring funding again during the 2021-22 fiscal year. So consequently, we need to keep all options open for as long as appropriate. And as we've done in past years, we'll prepare for student leadership a written tuition proposal, and we'll meet with the California State Student Association later this year to discuss it. Make it clear that it is not our intent to increase tuition rates for next year, but we need to keep the option open for the trustees in case any severe state budget cuts might become evident in the spring or summer of 2021. So in conclusion, the proposed 2021-22 operating budget request would provide the vital resources necessary to serve CSU students and the state of California. And as we've shared, the critical drivers of this year's request are the graduation initiative, mandatory costs, debt service on our facility needs, and funding the restoration of the current year's budget cut. These items will benefit all students as they work towards their degrees. We've all seen the remarkable results of our investments in the graduation initiative, and this is the critical time, as Executive Vice Chancellor Blanchard said earlier, to make sure that we continue that progress for our current and our future students. Therefore, we recommend approval of the 2021-22 operating budget request. Chair McGrory, that concludes the presentation, and we're happy to address any questions or comments.
Chancellor Relyea, just two quick items before we get to questions. One is I'm sure we must be tracking very closely what's happening in Washington with the HEROES Act or whatever else comes out of the Senate. And my understanding is in the HEROES Act that was passed about 5 or 6 months ago, there is a significant element for state and local government funding, which would include us, right?
Yes. And again, like you said, it really kind of depends on what version eventually comes out of this. It's very possible a version could emerge that would have money go both to states, but also money that was through the Department of Education targeted towards universities. And that's what happened this last time. And it's very possible it could happen again under the new administration.
The second question I have is that this budget doesn't address what's more probably of an internal issue, and that is the financial condition of our auxiliaries and as a result of the impacts of the pandemic. How worried are you on a scale of 1 to 5 of where they're at right now, and should we be doing anything on a preventive basis to try to make sure that we are shoring them up?
The campuses have been very focused on these auxiliaries, and you're exactly right, Chair McGrory, that what's different about this business cycle compared to every other business cycle we've been through is that the auxiliaries really got hit fairly significantly very early on in the process, much sooner than the reduction in the state budget. One of the things that we are doing to help campuses in some cases with liquidity is one of the items that's on the board agenda today, and that is to authorize the chancellor to, on behalf of the auxiliaries, allow them to take loans out to bridge obligations that they have. We don't expect this would be used for the vast majority of our auxiliaries, but for those auxiliaries that do need some additional liquidity during this time, that would give us the ability to do that. Right now, we have the authority to borrow money for auxiliaries for capital needs, not liquidity needs. And the item on today's agenda extends that authority to liquidity as well. So, getting back to your question, I'm not too worried about it. I mean, I don't want to in any way minimize the significance of the pain on the auxiliaries, but I have to say that the presidents and their cabinets have paid a lot of attention to the auxiliaries and have acted very quickly to reduce their cost structure to help manage the situation. Where we may need some additional liquidity help is where you have an auxiliary that has a fair amount of debt on facilities that it needs to service. Things like operating costs, the campuses have moved fairly quickly to address.
Okay, to the trustees. Trustee Kames.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to say that when you all were presenting, I looked at the agenda just to make sure that I was right. But on the agenda for basic needs, it said, previously, it says 15 million. And when I was looking at the presentation, I was a little surprised for it to say 30. And from our conversations at the last meeting, I expressed how thankful I am for the legislature, for the governor, and for the state, and for the money that they give us. And there, one, there should be a specific line that says basic needs, and two, essentially, we should be asking for more. So I just want to, express how thankful I am for that to be reflected in this request. And I really do appreciate all the hard work that you all have been doing for months to really talk to all of your constituencies. So thank you so much.
Trustee Keams, thank you very much for those comments. I have to say that the California's State Student Association has very clear that basic needs is their number one, number two, and number three priorities. And so I think this budget reflects that.
Thank you. Trustee Rains.
I also would like to echo Trustee Kames's statements, saying that, I've talked to a lot of student leaders about this, especially in CSSA, about the line item and how much money y'all have given to students directly through basic needs. And this is going to make a difference in a lot of people's lives so that they can attain their degree. And so coming from a basic needs student, I have to thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you, Trustee Rains. Appreciate your comment.
Trustee Taylor.
Thank you, Chair McGrory. I had two questions, but Steve, I wanted to follow up first on Jack's question about the auxiliaries. We've heard a lot in public comment about layoffs. Have the layoffs primarily come from the auxiliaries, or do we know?
The layoffs have been coming both from the auxiliaries and from the state side, really from both. The auxiliaries, the layoffs, are very painful for us, obviously. Anytime we have to go through layoffs, whether it's an auxiliary or on the state-funded side of things, it is really our absolute last measure that we want to take. And I have to say that campuses have done a remarkable job, even as painful as those layoffs are. They could have been much worse, and there could have been many more. If you think for a second about the level of the state cut being roughly about 7% of our state-funded budget, and that 80% of our state-funded budget is tied up in salaries and benefits, the percentage of our workforce that have gone through layoffs, and Evelyn probably knows that percentage, but I'm thinking it's closer to 1%, or it's a much smaller amount. The reason that it has been as small as it is, and again, I don't want to minimize it because it's very, very painful to do any layoffs, but the reason is that the presidents have, again, acted very quickly to minimize expenses on just about everything that they're doing on the campuses, and trying to do it in a way that does not impact the quality of the education that our students are getting.
Well, thank you.
Trustee Taylor, just for the record, I think in the represented employees on the state side, about 1.4%, sadly, and on the management side, on the state side, about 2.2%. And I don't actually know the percentage on folks that were the auxiliaries, but it was quite differential. The auxiliary that was the one I know is Long Beach had a store down on 2nd Street. Well, that store's been closed. So, a lot of folks in those kind of enterprises went away, but we could probably get you the statistics on on the non-state side, but we don't always collect those
Okay.
directly.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Two quick questions, Stephen. In the budget materials, very colorful materials that were included in our packet, on page 9, if I did the math correctly, if we get 100% of what we're asking for this year for the fiscal year 21-22, our expenditures will still be $135 million less than we spent in 2019-20. That still means we're cutting something. What do we know what we're going to be pulling the reins back on in order to meet this budget, even if we get 100% of what we want?
Well, the first thing I'll say is, first of all, thank you for the question. You're right. Your math is correct. The campuses have really done, I think, a remarkable job at finding every way to reduce expenses. Now, in addition, of course, the CARES Act money has been a big help, and CSU was the largest recipient of CARES Act money in the country, mainly because the rationale that was used was based on number of Pell students, which, of course, CSU has quite a lot of Pell students. The ability of campuses to not just, obviously, travel expenses were pretty much wiped out entirely, right? And part of that was because of COVID. Part of it was because it was just low-hanging fruit to go get. Part of the savings had to do with facility savings like water, sewer, trash, energy. A lot of one-time savings where we could afford not to refresh certain things like network hardware and a few other things. Having a hiring freeze generated quite a lot of savings. The early exit programs that many of our campuses have offered in order to avoid layoffs has been a big help as well. So I think what we'll continue to do is work with the campuses to try to find ways of reducing costs without impacting the quality of our students' education. The biggest worry, of course, is the graduation initiative. And I think that the presidents of our campuses have really taken to heart to try to cut everything except for those things that are going to impact how our students can get to classes, course sections and certain student support services that will keep the momentum going. However, we can't do that forever. A lot of these things are one-time fixes, and at some point we're going to have to restore that funding in order to keep that progress.
Great, thank you. Last question, Mr. Chair, with your indulgence. I think it'd be useful, particularly for the new trustees, CFO Rallier, to get a brief explanation about the State University Grant Program. The SUG program, $701 million, is one of our largest line items in our entire operating budget. And just to be clear, the SUG program is not Cal Grants. It is not Pell Grants. Where does the $701 million come from?
Great question. And I also appreciate your sensitivity to the new trustees, because it is anything but obvious how that works. And you're right, that we really kind of think of student aid in three buckets. One, as you mentioned, it comes from the state of California in the form of Cal Grants, another from the federal government in the form of Pell Grants. And then the State University Grant Program is a Cal State created program to supplement those other programs. And the way we fund it is simply to take right off the top of tuition. When we charge tuition and whenever we increase tuition, we don't do that very often, but when we do, we always set aside a portion of that for the State University Grant Program. So, if a tuition increase or any kind of tuition generates X dollars, it's really X minus Y is what you're really going to have, because Y we're going to sock into the SUG program. And obviously what we're trying to do is for those students who have the greatest need is to soften the financial hardship. for a very large proportion of our students, they don't pay any tuition. And it's because of the combination of Cal Grant, Pell Grant, and State University Grant that allows us to do that.
What is the percentage of students who pay no tuition now?
Ryan, do you recall? It's over half.
Over 50% of our students, not a dime out of their pocket for tuition.
I thought it was 60 last time we checked.
Well, there's two numbers. One is what students pay no tuition, and Ryan or Lauren may know that. I think it's around 50, but there's the other number is how many students have a portion of their tuition waived. And that's, of course, a bigger number. That's closer to 2/3, I believe.
Great. Thank you. No more questions, Mr. Chair.
Just Steve, I think we ought to emphasize a good good part of why we haven't felt more pain in the system this first year of this has been the use of reserves. And despite all of the mumble coming out of some offices in Sacramento, we started with about a $500 million reserve, which is 1 month of running room. And we probably burned about 100 million or so of that in terms of trying to keep things going this year. And the governor's office guidance is this is going to be a 3-year problem. So to use it all in 1 year would be completely irresponsible of us as trustees and of the chancellor's office. And I think they've done a very prudent job of balancing the use of the reserves against expense cuts and in some cases layoffs.
Chairman McGrory, if I may.
Yeah.
So real quickly on those designated balances and reserves, we surveyed our campuses when they submitted their budget plans for the current fiscal year and asked them specifically this year how much they would be utilizing their reserves for economic uncertainty this current year. And collectively, the campuses reported $180.4 million that they plan to use during the current year to help offset these cuts to the state appropriation. Now, that number will probably change at the end, right? Because while you plan to utilize reserves to some extent today or early in the year, all these other mitigation factors that Mr. Relier mentioned will come into play. If they have hiring freezes that are hiring chill that is a little bit larger than what they anticipated, then they might utilize their reserves a little bit less. Just wanted to give you that planning number just to let you know that campuses are taking this very seriously and utilizing their reserves, are planning to utilize the reserves now. And we're, as you suggested, did use them when the crisis broke in March as well.
Okay. Thanks, Ryan.
And Trustee McGrory, the other point you made, which I think bears repeating, is that we have to be careful not to think of this as a 1-year problem and use the reserves to solve every problem this year. The campuses are really looking at this the same way that the state is, and that is that this could be a 3-year problem, and they're gonna use their reserves to mitigate things, but they're gonna really try to do it over multiple years.
Yep. Okay, Trustee Infrastructure. Sebelius.
Thank you. I'm delighted to see this new budget request. It is much more robust as it was in September, and I want to thank you for including some of my suggestions. You, in your text, in your narrative of the agenda, you say the arguments for increased state funding are strong, and you referred that particularly to the graduation initiative, where we're asking for funding for the money that we didn't get last year and this year. And I agree that the arguments for the state to fund us on all these items are very, very strong. The graduation initiative clearly aligns with the state goals. So that is a good request. The mandatory costs, I'm glad that you baked in the cost for the implementation of the ethnic studies requirement, because that is a legal mandate. And if the legislators want us to offer this course, they should also fund it. So I appreciate that. And also the argument there should be compelling, because the mandatory costs is only asking for funds where we have price increases that we cannot control. I really appreciate your upping the ask for the facilities and infrastructure needs to 50 million, which could generate 900 million for our deferred maintenance. thank you very much. That is exactly what I suggested in the September meeting. And the state should like that too, because that is a stimulus for the California economy. If we put $900 million into construction, into maintaining our falling apart facilities, that creates jobs, that puts money into the economy. And the general fund restoration, that you went from, I think, 30 million to now a full restoration, from 10% now to full restoration, is excellent. I really want to compliment you on this. And I hope and I assume that when our funding is restored, then that would eliminate the need for furloughs. Because if our funding is as it was before, then I don't see any need for the furloughs anymore. Also, if we avoid the furloughs, we will have no cuts in salaries to the CSU employees. Also, we would avoid cuts in services. Please remember that furloughs mean less work for less services. So not only the employees would not suffer, the students would also not suffer with reduced services, reduced classes, reduced advising, or reduced counseling. And also, clearly, it would avoid the damaging morale and bad campus climate that furloughs 10 years ago have caused and that lasted so long. And this is also the state legislators, for them, this is also a stimulus package. If the salaries remain the same, consumption will be high, sales taxes will come in. This, it is not only in the benefit, it's not only selfish request for the CSU, it benefits the whole economy, everybody who's related to the university. Well, all that said, and despite all my gratitude, I'm still surprised that we still not have any single line item for one-time funding. In the September meeting, I suggested, I think, 4 different line items, and I do not want to insist on all of this that I have suggested, but you also have stated over the years that the legislators are more inclined to fund one-time items, especially when the economic situation is uncertain. Among the several one-time requests that I suggested during the September meeting, I assume that there's one, and I will only bring up one, that would be very favorably received by the legislators. And that would be the one that I proposed for funding faculty training for online instruction. In the September meeting, I suggested a request of $42 million to train approximately half of our CSU faculty. The amount was extrapolated based on the cost on my campus for such a training. In the meantime, Chancellor White has informed us and the public that already 17,000 faculty members, or about 60%, have received such professional development. So we do not need the funding of 42 million to train half, but I think even if we don't expect 100% compliance, if we train 90% of the faculty members, it still would be reasonable to ask for 24 million. That would help to train another third or 30% of our faculty members. Now, I am not a member of the Finance Committee, and therefore I cannot make a motion now. However, I can do it during our final session. That said, it makes more sense to discuss that proposal right now in the context of the presentation and with the Chancellor's Office staff ready to provide input. Now, the board and the Chancellor's Office have heard now my proposal to add a one-line item of $24 million to help for professional development to train faculty in remote instruction. So I suppose there are 3 options now. Either one of the committee members can make the motion according to my proposal, and the committee can vote on that matter now, or I can remove the item from consent later at the final Board of Trustees meeting, and the whole board can debate that matter and vote on it. but then I feel it would be a little bit out of context. Or if we discuss it right now, and that suggestions should not be seen favorably by either the Chancellor's Office staff or by the board, after this discussion, I might choose not to make that motion at all and not take that item off the consent agenda. But I think it's a worthwhile ask. I think the legislators would look favorable on it because everybody can see the need of our faculty to be well-versed in online instruction.
Well, Romy, very good presentation. This is the most conservative approach you've taken so far. That's good. So you're putting 24 million on the table for online education. Let's go to the next trustee and see where we end up here. Trustee Adamson.
Well, my question is very simple, actually, Steve, and that is, does this budget for 2021 properly position us for the salary increase funding that we're going to need with the union contracts that come up in 2020, 21 or 22? We know that we have substantial obligation, although we were successful in delaying a number of the unions, but we still have 2021 obligations that are going to hit us. And will those, and do we have any funding line item that will support that?
$1 million is.
No,
Percent.
I don't think we have any. We don't have anything in there for salary increases, right?
We don't have anything in there for salary increases. And I don't know if Evelyn might want to comment about any program salary increases in terms of contracts.
Okay. No, we don't have it in the contract that would state we would have to give a GSI across the board. In the contracts where we have increases in salaries would be if you would have a promotion from one position to another, if you have what we call an in-range progression, reclassification, but as for mandatorily having to give an increase, a GSI, general salary increase every year, that is not bargained, no.
So we have no unions that have any clause that in 2021, 22 are going to be receiving any general increase.
That's correct. If you recall, when we extended the contracts, the only bargaining unit that is not extended through 2022 is CFA.
So there are no contractual obligations next year.
That's correct.
With a minor, not a contractual obligation, this is Tim, but there is a minimum wage obligation, which is in the budget for a little less than $6 million.
And health insurance too, right? No.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. Larry, is that it?
Yeah, are we going to discuss Romy's?
Yeah, I think at the end of this, let's see where we end up, and then we'll have a motion. And
Because
then,
I would love to hear from staff before we put a motion on the floor.
okay. Trustee Kimbell, Chair Kimbell.
Yeah, I was just texting. Somebody's squeaky toy, somebody's dog's squeaky toy was in the background. I don't know whose puppy that was. Anyway, I know we're behind, but I just wanted to tell Steve and his crew again how terrific the operating budget was. I really think it's one of the, it's not great news, but it was beautifully done. Really accessible and just terrific. I had a few questions, sort of scary, a couple of scary things in there. One thing was that Peter raised was the SUG, which I know that it's something that our new trustees are going to learn about. It's something that's always sort of like the Loch Ness Monster. It comes up, you read about it. And I was just wondering, just quickly, and maybe we should do another deep dive on this one of these days, is the extent to which it's grown from 4 million in 82 to 701 million. And I didn't do the math on how many times, what that exponential growth is. And I imagine part of it is the size of our university now. But also, when you were talking about every time we have a tuition hike, automatically a percentage comes off the top of that hike. And I know we've had a lot, our tuition has grown a lot since then. So is that the predominant reason it's grown? Is it the population of our students, the tuition? or just we have more students who are poorer, or probably is it all three?
It really is driven, and thank you, Chair Kimbell, for that question. It's really driven by both the number of students, which of course has grown dramatically over the last couple of decades at CSU, plus the growth in tuition over the last couple of decades. And while we haven't, I think maybe in the last 9 years, we've maybe increased tuition 5% in the last 9 years. There were, as you know, some pretty steep increases during the Great Recession in the 2008 through 2011 period. So combination of more students and higher tuition. And you're exactly right, the way you characterized, anytime we do a tuition increase, we really only net a portion of it because we right off the top take a big chunk for the State University Grant Program. And it's really, it's a board decision. It's something that we could change in the future if we wanted to, if we decided that we didn't want to put additional money into the SUG program. But we've done it because, the students who have the greatest need clearly benefit from that program.
And is there a formula? I mean, is there a percentage that comes off every time, even say when we did the $270 increase, 5% or a certain 10% comes off right off of that? Is that how it works?
Well, if I could jump in, Steve.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so Trustee Campbell, this is really tied into the board's student fee policy that began many decades ago and has been updated many times. But at the core of it, dating back to 93, 94, the principle that was put in place was that if tuition were to increase at any given point, the rate of tuition were to increase, 1/3 of that revenue that was generated would be set aside in order to help support students through the State University Grant Program. So the logic behind it was that if a student was eligible for a SUG, they were eligible for to have their entire cost of their tuition covered by the program if they were eligible for the program. And so what happens is that when the rate goes up, if you don't also include on the cost side or the expenditure side an increase to cover that tuition rate increase, then you'd have a situation where students would be not having their tuition fully covered by this program. So that was the rationale and the logic behind it. But as Steve said, you do have the right as a board to determine how much of the program you actually do fund. It is a cost, it is a program that you run as a university, and it's supported by tuition revenue and the operating fund in general.
Okay. And then, Tim, did you want to jump in on that? Because I had one more question.
No, go ahead and finish your questions, and then I'd like to make a comment. Yes.
Okay. So, well, this is about something else. On page 17, you talk about retirement benefits. And what was also kind of scary, interesting in there is the fact that the CSU's pensionable payroll is different from what the state has been, that portion the state has been funding since 2013, 2014. So seems that every year that we go on, our portion increases. The state is only paying on the 2013 amount, and that will continue to grow and grow. That is very worrisome. Can you, briefly address that?
Well, I think you have put it exactly right. And it's worrisome to us as well that the state, and it was really, I think of it as just kind of another form of a budget cut, really, to CSU. The state determined that in 2013, that would be the base year above which CSU would have to eat out of its own operating budget any increases in the pensionable costs beyond that 2013 year. It's something that we've argued with the state about quite a lot, and with the Department of Finance, we feel that it's not correct, that it's not fair, that CSU should get that incremental money for those additional costs. But we've not been successful so far in getting that changed. But Chair Kimbell, you're exactly right that it is a problem that, of course, in 2013 was not a huge problem, but every year becomes a bigger problem.
Yeah, it's getting bigger. And then just finally, because I was just curious about the employees who on the portion on tuition waivers. The CSU offers system-wide tuition waivers for employees and their dependents pursuant to collective bargaining agreements. Who are these employees? Do our faculty's children get free tuition? I'm wondering what is that?
There are a lot of, and Ryan might jump in here. There are a lot of classifications of employees who get those, including faculty and staff, veterans, other categories. Ryan, do you want to expand on that?
We talked.
I think also greater expertise could be from Human Resources Office as well. But generally speaking, my understanding is that our collective bargaining agreements, as well as our non-represented employees, have that additional benefit where you as an employee can have a discounted tuition. And the other item too is that children of employees also have a discount on their tuition as well. But I would defer to my colleagues in Human Resources.
Okay. And Ryan, you have it absolutely correct. So we have employees who actually have what we call fee waiver. So they're able to get their degree through the CSU as a full-time employee. And then they have the dependents who actually receive a discounted rate to have their dependents be able to come and get their degrees at the CSU also. So it's a great benefit, actually, and our employees do use it.
A pretty standard university benefit, though. I mean, that's the norm.
Trustee McGrory, you're right. It is, and sometimes it is an issue when you're recruiting someone from another university. Oftentimes, the university where they're at provides that benefit because you're right. It is pretty standard, and by us also having that benefit, it allows us to be more competitive.
Chancellor White, your last budget comments.
Well, I don't want to be the Grinch that stole Christmas, but I do want to be the chancellor that manages our expectations. And, we've asked for mid $500 million requests year in and year out during the good years in California. And with one exception, we've sort of been able to make the case through the political process for about half, again, rough numbers of what we've asked for. So this isn't a good time, and there's a lot of excitement about the fact that the state has $11 billion that they had not anticipated in revenues. But I remind us that on Sunday, there were 13 purple counties, and on Monday, there's 41 purple counties. And so the small businesses who are the mom and pop shops around the state, are going to have to decrease their business or close for a while in some of these hotspots. And if you just look at the epidemiological data, it's not going to end tomorrow. Any ascent in an infectious disease has to reach up to an asymptote and then come back down. That's one point. The second point is yesterday in the governor's press conference, when asked about this unexpected revenue, he spoke a bit about his number one priority, understandably, is going to be helping small business. So, there's a lot of small businesses in the state of 40 million people, and $11 billion isn't going to go that far. And we're asking for $500 million in our ask. So I simply want us to be clear that our responsibility as trustees is to make the case of what we need. But then we enter the political process and the economic realities. And the numbers that come out on the governor's budget in January historically have been the ones that are the most important, that ultimately drive where we end up. But a lot can happen between now and next summer, depending on this pandemic and its economic impact. So while we're optimistic, I think we also have to be realistic. And then the final thing is I would dissuade us from spending much time on talking about asking for one-time money. Not that a case can't be made intellectually, but if you ask for a significant amount of one-time money in your budget, your recurring budget ask, you've made it a lot simpler for them to not give us recurring money. And so I think usually what happens is when we work through this process in February, March, April, May, June, is the outcome will be, look, we think this is important, but we can't dedicate recurring base support to it, but we can give you a chunk of money for one-time stuff. And so I think the one-time stuff comes up later in the process rather than putting it in the board's request, because it simply will then clearly take away from our recurring request, which at the end of the day is the most important thing for the trustees and the presidents to know about, is predictable, sufficient, ongoing funding.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, the other thing we should point out is that we're very proud of the fact we had enrollment growth this year, but we didn't have any money to pay for it. I mean, all that had to be absorbed inside all 23 campuses' budgets. And if that continues, it's like an unfunded item. And I know some of the campuses, that has caused a big problem in the past where they've had to use reserves to accommodate their enrollment growth. And that's not something that's sustainable at all. Okay, so we have the Chancellor's recommendation. We have Romy's desire to add a one-time item of $24 million for online education for the faculty. Is there anybody who wants to discuss the addition of $24 million for the online faculty? The Chancellor has weighed in on it at this point and advised against it. Is there anybody who feels strongly in favor of Romy's addition at this time?
The Chancellor was against a one-time request. I'm happy to make this a line item in our ongoing request. And if we need faculty development every year, if we take 10% of the faculty and train them, it costs about $3,000 per faculty member. So that would be, we could add a $9 million line item in ongoing funds that would actually be in alignment with the Chancellor's argument that it's not a good moment for one-time requests. And the legislators then can look at it and say, well, you know, we cannot fund you that much, but maybe we can give you that amount of money for 1 year for now.
Is there anybody on the committee or outside the committee who wants to discuss this any further? Hearing none. Romy, I think we kind of set this aside for a while and see what happens, okay? Okay, is there a motion to approve?
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Second, Mr. Chair.
Second. Ms. Kiss, would you like to call the roll of the committee?
Yes, I will. Trustee Adamson.
Yes.
Trustee Carney.
Yes.
Trustee Fong.
Yes.
Trustee Kames.
Yes.
Trustee McGrory.
Yes.
Trustee Reynos.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Trustee Simon.
Yes.
Trustee Taylor.
Aye.
Chair Campbell.
Yes.
Chancellor White.
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously.
Okay, great. The last item, item 7, is an information item. For the sake of time, Steve, do you feel obliged that we need to have a presentation on this, or can we wait till it comes back for final action?
You know, I know we're low on time, and this has been brought to the board in the past. And what I can do is perhaps, since this is an information item, maybe make some very brief comments, if that's okay, Chair McGrory, about what this is, because we will bring this back in January. So I think it's okay for us to shorten this and just make some very brief comments about where we stand. And I might just ask President Castro to make a few just very brief comments, and then we'll tee this up for the January meeting, if that's okay. And so simply put, this to me is it's an exciting project, but it's a very necessary project, and that is to really revamp and restore what is a very fragile and aged utility infrastructure project at a situation at the Fresno campus. It's being done in a very creative way as a public-private partnership, which has, I think, we followed this process, put a lot of work into this. The team at Fresno and the Chancellor's office worked very closely together, and I think we're now at a stage where we'll be finalizing over the next couple of months the terms of this agreement and coming to the board for an action item in January. Typically, what we'll do on a project this size is do an information item 1 month and then follow with an action item at the following board meeting. So I'll just end my comments right there and just see if President Castro wanted to provide any other color or commentary on this.
Thank you, Executive Vice Chancellor Relier. I'll be brief as well. This project is critically important to Fresno State. Our current central plant was built when Dwight Eisenhower was president. So that was a while back. There have been very few modest upgrades to it since that time. We believe we have a viable path forward through a public-private partnership, and the campus is ready to move forward with your approval at the January meeting, where we would bring a more detailed financial information to you. Thanks for your support.
President Castro, are there any questions of Chancellor Relier, Vice Chancellor Relier, or President Castro? I don't see any. Chair Kimbell, that concludes the business of the Finance Committee.
Chair McGrory. So now we are going to move